The Empire Strikes Back is one of the most well-regarded sequels ever made. Released all the way back in 1980, The Empire Strikes Back is often praised for its darker tone, deeper storytelling, and unforgettable twists. In this video, we're gonna dive deep into the history of this film nearly 45 years after its initial release. We'll cover the challenging production of the film and how it all came together. We'll dive into the themes and the story of The Empire Strikes Back and why it's considered by many to be the best Star Wars movie. We'll cover how the film changed over time with Lucas's special edition, and we'll wrap up the video by looking at the reception of the film. So let's travel back in time to 1977 and look at the production of The Empire Strikes Back. The biggest takeaway from the production of the first Star Wars was that George Lucas had a strong understanding of the time period he was in. The 70s were a dark and uneasy time for Americans, and that was reflected in the cinema. Lucas wanted to change that, and Star Wars proved to be exactly what the world needed all the way back in 1977. After Star Wars concluded its theatrical run, it was arguably the most successful movie ever made. In the entire history of 20th Century Fox, 1977 was its most profitable year because of Star Wars. By the way, Star Wars wasn't just popular in America, it was popular all over the world. If you remember, when I was discussing the production of A New Hope, I mentioned that Lucas had two demands in the negotiating room: gaining the rights to the sequels and gaining the rights to the merchandise. After Star Wars was a huge hit, merchandise for the film was everywhere. Mark Hamill was elated to hear that his face would be on the cover of cereal boxes. Just like Lucas intended, Star Wars' biggest fans were children, and boy were they hooked. Demand for Star Wars toys was so high, but by Christmas of 1977, toys for the film weren't ready yet. So Kenner decided to sell these Star Wars action figure vouchers that kids could get on Christmas, knowing that in a few months they would be able to finally get Star Wars toys. In the Academy Awards for the following year, Star Wars was nominated for 11 Oscars and won 6 of them. It won Best Art Direction, Costume Design, Editing, Visual Effects, Sound, and Original Score. Even though it didn't win the award, Star Wars was also nominated for Best Picture. Why am I so insistent on highlighting how successful Star Wars was? It's not just because Star Wars is my favorite franchise, it's because when the sequel was in the works, you'd think that Lucas would have the whole world available to him, right? How could anyone deny the man who literally made the most successful movie ever made? Well, unfortunately, the success of the sequel was not guaranteed. As you'll see in a second, the production of The Empire Strikes Back was just as challenging as the original film. So much so that Lucas had to risk his entire career just to get the film made. During the production of the first Star Wars, Lucas often clashed with the studios. Lucas was a very stubborn man, and he wanted his vision to be made above all else. Luckily, 20th Century Fox wasn't too overbearing, but after the success of Star Wars, Lucas never wanted to work with the studio that much again. So Lucas went to Fox and only gave them the distribution rights for the sequels. Now, in order to get the sequel made, Lucas would have to finance the movie almost entirely by himself. For pretty much any business, let alone making a film, investing your own personal money in a project is a big no-no. There are so many factors that are out of your control that could go wrong. But Lucas didn't care. Lucas was a storyteller through and through. There was nothing more important to him than having his vision realized. Lucas once said, "I'm very, very stubborn, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. I make up my mind about something and I'm willing to go all the way to the end for it." I think for a lot of movies, you have to do that. If you believe in something strongly enough, you really have to be able to commit everything to make it work. And this is exactly what Lucas did. The theme of the production for The Empire Strikes Back is that Lucas was willing to sacrifice everything to make sure that the future of Star Wars would be successful. This didn't just mean The Empire Strikes Back, but again, the entire franchise. The first thing he had to do to ensure that his vision would be realized was not work with the studios. In the process of making THX and American Graffiti, the studios came in, changed things, and mucked them up. After those experiences, I just said I'm never going to do this again. I'm never gonna have somebody else saying, well, we're just gonna cut the ending of the movie off, or that whole battle in the first sequence, we don't need that, do we? Since Lucas needed to now finance the movie on his own, he took out personal loans with these banks, and even used profits from the merchandise sales to help fund the movie. Industrial Light and Magic was now a fully fledged company, and proceeds from that would also go to funding The Empire Strikes Back. Under no circumstances circumstances would Lucas compromise his vision. Now, while what Lucas did was brilliant, it also often doesn't work out. As I've stated before, Lucas's attention wasn't solely on the sequel, it was also on the future of the franchise. Oftentimes, when a studio isn't focused on a movie itself and is instead focused on the bigger picture, things go wrong. How many movies in the past 15 years have we seen suffer because the movie was more focused on setting up a universe rather than telling its own story? We've seen it happen quite a bit, especially with comic book films. So how come Star Wars ended up working for Lucas and not all these other films? Because in Lucas's case, he was one man focused on the future, while in these other examples, it was the studios focused on the future. When a studio looks ahead, it's solely because of profits. Look how good The Avengers was! Let's now make our own cinematic universe so we can make billion-dollar films. Yeah, that's gonna go very well. Lucas, on the other hand, wasn't just concerned with profits. Of course, he wanted the films to make money so he could save his career, but Lucas was far more concerned with having his vision realized. Lucas's broader attention stemmed from telling an authentic story, not from a studio wanting to make more money. This is why Star Wars succeeded. When it came time to actually make The Empire Strikes Back, Lucas had made an interesting decision to not direct the movie. Lucas approached his former film school teacher Irvin Kershner and asked him to direct The Empire Strikes Back. Kershner was someone who had never directed a blockbuster before, but Kershner was great at character-focused storytelling, and Lucas knew that was exactly what his sequel needed. George Lucas did not have a good time directing the first Star Wars. He was constantly clashing with the rest of the crew, and as we covered before, it led to him hospitalized with exhaustion. Now that Lucas was focused on the future of the franchise, his goals and aspirations were too vast to focus on the everyday struggles of directing. Lucas said, "Kershner is worrying primarily about the specific moment or scene he has to deal with, and what I'm constantly keeping my eye on is the whole picture and how it's all fitting together." Lucas compared his role with The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi to the role of a showrunner for a TV series. He would make sure everything went according to plan, but he wouldn't be there to oversee every minor detail. When it came down to the sequel to Star Wars, the most important thing for Lucas was that the film not be a rehash of the first Star Wars. Back then, sequels were often frowned upon because they were seen as a cheap way to make money. Just repeat the formula of the first movie and boom, you have a moneymaker. Since Lucas now had the entire franchise in mind, he didn't just see Star Wars as a series of movies, but as one large story. The Empire Strikes Back was going to be part 2 of a trilogy. Since the second act of any story is usually the act where the characters are tested and hope is at its lowest point, Lucas couldn't just do another adventure plot like A New Hope. Under no circumstances could Empire be a rehash of A New Hope. It had to be more complex. Lucas said, "Obviously, one way to make a very successful commercial sequel is to copy the original exactly. I just couldn't do that. Not even if I knew that Empire wouldn't be as successful as Star Wars. What I really care about is completing the current trilogy. Only after it's finished will our audience be aware of the actual scope of the series." Along with revolutionizing the story, Lucas wanted to continue to improve the visual effects. New strategies and technologies were used to make The Empire Strikes Back. When it came to Yoda, no one had ever made a puppet look and feel that real before. It was a huge achievement in puppetry. During the Battle of Hoth, the use of stop motion was also something that was revolutionary. It added scale to the battle that wasn't there before. This is a theme that will continue on with Return of the Jedi. Lucas is always pushing those boundaries. When it came time to draft the story, Lucas initially brought on Leigh Brackett to write the script. The first draft wasn't as different as A New Hope's first draft was, but there were still some interesting differences. There is nowhere mentioned in this first draft that Vader would be Luke's father. It is actually reaffirmed that Vader killed Luke's father. Luke does go to train with Yoda, but Yoda's full name is Minch Yoda, and he didn't originally have his backward speech. Luke's sister is addressed, but it clearly wasn't going to be Leia. There was also going to be a major subplot of Han reconnecting with his stepfather who was in charge of a mining guild. Regardless, the broad strokes of the story were the same, like the characters going to Cloud City and meeting Lando. People love to talk about the importance of a plan when writing a series of films, but arguably the most important part of the entire trilogy wasn't even established until the second draft of the second movie. Nowhere was it mentioned what inspired Lucas to make Vader Luke's father, but it had to have been sometime after the first draft. Eventually, Lucas decided to scrap this first draft and wrote the second draft himself. This draft ended up being very similar to the final movie. In order to tune down the finer details of the script, Lucas brought on Lawrence Kasdan to complete it. As I mentioned before, the key parts of this story was that it was going to serve as the second act of a larger story. It was crucial that Luke loses in this movie, that he gets defeated repeatedly and is forced to grow. In fact, it was important that all the main characters be tested, including Han and Leia. I've taken a lot more chances in this story. It's a tragedy, a traditional second act. In the second act, you always give your characters a problem. There are no real winners in Empire, as there were in the first film. And for the characters, it's an emotional tragedy. And yes, the final script did include Darth Vader being Luke's father, but more on that later. In March of 1979, almost 2 years after the release of Star Wars, principal photography on The Empire Strikes Back began. You'd think after the disastrous production of the first Star Wars that things would get smoother from here, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Just like how Tunisia was miserable to shoot in, filming the Hoth scenes in Norway was also a disaster. Supposedly, Norway had its worst storm in 50 years. Snow was so deep that a handful of scenes in the movie were filmed right outside the hotel the crew was staying at. At least shooting in Elstree Studios would be better, right? Not really. Stanley Kubrick was filming The Shining just before Lucas was going to film Empire, but supposedly there was a fire that delayed Kubrick significantly. This subsequently delayed Star Wars as well. Principal photography ended up taking 35 days longer than initially planned. The film also went $10 million over budget. Things got so bad for Lucas that Bank of America pulled their loan, putting Lucas in a terrifying position. Lucas still refused to go back to the studios, however. He now had to borrow money from his other companies, putting those at stake as well. Empire Strikes Back couldn't just be good. The film had to be insanely popular or Lucas would go bankrupt. His entire career as a director could be over. Lucas said, "I'm faced with a situation where everything I own, everything I ever earned, is wrapped up in this picture. If it isn't a success, not only could I lose everything, but I could also end up millions of dollars in debt, which would be very difficult to get out from under." Moral of the story here, Lucas was so passionate about his story and his vision, he basically gambled his entire career. I don't know any story of a filmmaker who had a journey like George Lucas. Now, despite the delays and the stress, Lucas was still able to complete The Empire Strikes Back before his targeted release date in May of 1980. There was one aspect of this production that George Lucas had never faced before. It wasn't the added pressure or anything like that, but public interest. For the first time, there was mass intrigue in the movie Lucas was making. In today's day and age, we hear stories about how secretive these movies are, and we hear rumors from leakers about what the movies are about. Back then, this was almost never an issue, until of course The Empire Strikes Back. People were desperate to know what would happen in the sequel to Star Wars. Mark Hamill mentioned that Lucas and Kirshner created bogus scripts to leak to the press. This is actually something companies do today. Now, of course, of everything in the movie, the one thing Lucas wanted to protect more than anything was the reveal that Vader was Luke's father. This secret was so important to Lucas that very few people, even on set, knew about it. When it came time to actually film the scene, only Mark Hamill and Irvin Kershner knew the truth on set. The official script had Vader saying, "Obi-Wan killed your father," but Mark Hamill knew the truth and was told to act it in a different way. Supposedly during the premiere of the movie, Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher didn't know the truth and they found out about it while watching the movie for the first time.
So at the screening, when that happened, Harrison turned to me and said, "Hey kid, you didn't fucking tell me that."
This was how secretive Lucas was with that reveal. On May 21st, 1980, The Empire Strikes Back was released in theaters. Lucas's fears of not making his money back were quelled relatively quickly. Empire made its money back fast. Lucas, of course, used this money to get out of his debt, but he also used the money to continue to build up his companies, to create Skywalker Ranch, and he even paid so many of his employees extra with the profits. Roughly 5 years beforehand, Lucas had a dream of making movies fun again, and with The Empire Strikes Back being another success, Lucas had fulfilled that prophecy. The story of the production of The Empire Strikes Back is one of faith and passion. If Lucas never stuck to his guns and never fought for his vision, who knows what the Star Wars franchise would look like 45 years later. Now, many people say The Empire Strikes Back is one of the best sequels ever made. Is that really the case? Well, let's dive deep into the story and themes of The Empire Strikes Back. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 17.1% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. If you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. What makes The Empire Strikes Back such a beloved film? A lot of people point to the darker tone, the themes of failure and resilience, or maybe even the insane twists. This is all true, but there have been plenty of sequels that are darker or surprising, but they aren't necessarily great. What's different about The Empire Strikes Back? I struggled with this for a bit. I don't want to repeat the same old talking points that people have been saying for 45 years. Similar to the first movie, what makes this movie great is a rich tapestry. But if I had to pick one thing, I would say it's that The Empire Strikes Back was the pinnacle of subverting expectations. The phrase subverting expectations became very popular when The Last Jedi came out. Regardless of what you think about that film, it's The Empire Strikes Back that is the true king of subverting expectations. Almost everything about this movie was unexpected for a sequel of its time. I mentioned this before, but back in the day, sequels were usually a rehash of the original but with a twist. The way this is often said makes it sound like a negative thing, but that's not necessarily true. Up until recently, most of the time films in a franchise were episodic. Look at something like James Bond. For the most part, each movie is its own story. There's little to no wider narrative. More famously would be a horror movie. Every Scream movie pretty much follows the same formula. This isn't a bad thing. If you're a fan of my channel, most of my videos follow the same formula. The reason this is often done is because fans like what worked. If you're a fan of the Fast and Furious movies, you don't go into those movies expecting deep character work. You just want to see really great action sequences with cars. With Star Wars, people expected Star Wars 2 to be another adventure where Han, Luke, and Leia would fight Darth Vader and the Empire and save the day. If Star Wars 2 did end up going this route, the movie would still probably do well. It's just Lucas simply didn't want to go down this route. The first Star Wars, as great as it was, wasn't a very original film. I've always believed that if you took Star Wars and made it a novel series, it just doesn't do as well. The story is good, but it's what comes with being a movie that makes it so great. As I've stated before, Lucas wanted the first Star Wars to be a part of a larger narrative. Since he had initially planned a trilogy, Star Wars 2 had to serve as the second act of that larger story. It had to add real stakes. The story had to become so unexpected that the third film could be whatever it wanted. So Lucas looked at the first film and said, let's make the second film be the complete opposite of that. The first film had the main character go on this fun adventure where he defies all odds and saves the day in the end, so the second film is going to have him literally fail at everything he does and lose in the end. The first film had our heroes running from the Empire constantly only for them to escape. In the sequel, our heroes are going to be captured and not all of them will escape. The first film had the rebels defeating the Empire against all odds. In the sequel, the rebels were going to lose their big battle in the beginning of the movie. I could go on and on, I think you get my point. Almost every aspect of this movie goes in a direction you don't expect. Let's now dive a bit deeper than that. There are two storylines in this film, the storyline with Luke, Yoda, and Vader, and the storyline with Han, Leia, and Lando. Let's start with Luke first. You can't talk about Luke's story without understanding that it's a part of a wider trilogy. Lucas wrote The Empire Strikes Back knowing that there was going to be a third movie. Therefore, Luke doesn't have a complete arc in this movie. The whole movie is just him being flawed and then losing, being flawed and then losing, being flawed and then losing. The reason why Lucas obviously wanted to do this was because he knew at some point in the third movie, Luke was going to declare himself a Jedi, representing everything he dreamed of being in the beginning of the first movie. Luke telling the Emperor, "I am a Jedi like my father before me," is the climax of the trilogy. That moment only hits hard if becoming a Jedi was actually difficult. Because he suffered so much in The Empire Strikes Back, declaring himself a Jedi in Return of the Jedi works. So the movie begins, and the first thing that happens is that Luke needs saving. He gets attacked by the Wampa, escapes, but would have died if Han didn't save him. Right away, we know that the kid that blew up the Death Star from the first movie is not invincible. He can get beaten up and almost die. So far, so good. Now, I'm gonna do something a bit unexpected. I'm gonna provide a critique of this movie. What? The Empire Strikes Back is a perfect movie. How can you critique it? Let me explain. The Battle of Hoth I find to be one of the weaker battles in the Star Wars movies. Yeah, the battle was a visual marvel. It's wonderfully shot and wonderfully paced. My critique of the battle is that, at least for Luke, there's no character beats for him. For Luke's story, if he just left Hoth after the Wampa attack and went straight to Dagobah, nothing changes. Luke is a participant in the Battle of Hoth. We see him flying around and taking down an AT-AT, but as we come come to learn, Luke's arc in this movie is about showing his impatience, his recklessness, and his flaws. We see how far he is from truly becoming a Jedi, but there's nothing during the Battle of Hoth that advances that story. As I said before, he just flies around, takes down an AT-AT, and leaves. It could have been really interesting if the Battle of Hoth served as a catalyst for Luke's impatience. Obviously, the objective of the battle is that the rebels need to stall the Empire so the transports can escape. What if, say, instead of tossing a grenade into the AT-AT, Luke tried to use the Force in some way to stop it? But because Luke wasn't strong enough in the Force yet, the AT-AT was able to get close enough and blow up one of these transports. Luke now feels guilty for not being able to save some of the rebels. This way, after the battle, he goes to Dagobah so he can begin his training. He never wants to let the rebels down again, and that's why he's so impatient with his training. The sooner he becomes a Jedi, the sooner he can save more lives. It's a small change, but one that I feel adds a bit more weight to the Battle of Hoth. Anyway, Luke goes to Dagobah and we meet Yoda. If you followed my channel for a while now, you may know my thoughts on Yoda. I thought the most brilliant decision ever made by a Star Wars storyteller was the creation of the lightsaber. It's just a brilliant idea. The second smartest decision ever was the concept of Yoda. Yoda's sheer existence does so much world building for the Force. In the first movie, the Force doesn't get much explaining. It's really vague in that it's this magical entity that you can tap into and do magical things. In The Empire Strikes Back, for one, the way Yoda describes the Force is so awe-inducing. It's an energy field that surrounds all living things. I just love that. But seeing an old 2-foot-tall alien being able to tap into this Force and lift an X-Wing perfectly exemplifies what the Force is. It has a dark side and light side, sure, but anyone can use it. It doesn't matter how tall or big you are, it's about training, discipline, and belief that makes you strong with the Force. Yoda lifting the X-Wing is one of the most powerful sequences of the franchise. The way Lucas describes the Force is perfectly represented by Yoda, and that's why the concept of him was such a great idea. Now, how does this all relate to Luke's story? The entirety of Luke's training with Yoda is to show us his flaws. Right when Luke gets to Dagobah, he shows us his recklessness. He flies straight into these clouds and has no clue where he's going. He then crashes into the lake. That's reckless. Frankly, Luke is so lucky that of all the places he would have landed on the entire planet, he landed within a mile of where Yoda lives. Over and over again, we see his impatience. He fails Yoda's first test when he repeatedly asks Yoda to go to the real Yoda. Now, the cave sequence is one of the more interesting scenes, because a lot of it depends on how you interpret the sequence. Some just see it as foreshadowing for Luke becoming Vader, but I think it's a lot more than that. Luke is told that what he will find in the cave is what he brings with him. Luke ignores Yoda and brings his weapons. By being aggressive, Luke invites aggression. He fights Vader, and even though he technically wins, he sees that he could easily become Vader too. The scene is basically telling Luke continuing down this path could likely lead him to the dark side. Even he is not safe from it. Great sequence. He then of course fails to lift the X-Wing, not believing in himself or his abilities. The sequence ends with Luke rushing off to go save his friends. I want to cover one other small critique. When Luke is first talking to Yoda, Yoda asks him, "Why must you become a Jedi?" Luke says, "Well, because of my father, I guess." I don't like that response from Luke. It just doesn't seem that personal. I think what the story was going for is that Luke has idolized this idea of who his father was. Since Luke's entire family is dead, becoming a Jedi is his way of connecting to that family he never had. I love this. It's a lot more personal and it makes the Vader reveal at the end hit a lot harder. I just wish Luke's motivation was a bit more clear here. Instead of saying, "Well, because of my father, I guess," maybe Luke says, "My father was a Jedi once, I hope I can one day be just like him." He's basically saying the same thing, it just sounds a bit more personal, which is important. Anyway, Luke goes off to try and save his friends. I love this being the ending sequence for the movie. For one, the ending of the last movie was this big rebellion saving battle. I like that the ending of this movie is a lot more personal. Only this movie and Revenge of the Sith have a third act that isn't a big battle, and both work fairly well. But going back to the theme of this video, what makes the ending to Luke's story work is that it's a complete subversion of what we're used to. In the last movie, Luke was the one who saved the day against all odds. In the second movie, you may be expecting the same thing. Luke would rescue Leia and save Han just in time. Well, that doesn't happen. Not only does he not rescue Leia or Han, but he is the one that ends up needing rescuing. Luke fails in every conceivable way during this final act. Luke doesn't save his friends. He doesn't even help Leia escape. Lando was the one who saved Leia, not Luke. And then when Luke fights Vader, he's completely outmatched. Luke's getting straight up bullied by Vader. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into the fight. It's been covered for the past 45 years. We all know it's fantastic. I do want to touch on Vader though. The Empire Strikes Back has to be Vader's best movie. In the first movie, he's just there. He's a stand-in for the typical bad guy in an adventure story. The Empire Strikes Back is what makes Vader a force to be reckoned with. It is so refreshing to see a villain that is competent. Vader gets shit done in this movie. We don't necessarily fear the Empire, we just fear Darth Vader. Almost all of Vader's scenes in this movie are him just interacting with other Imperials, and this was such a brilliant idea. If you have Vader interact with the heroes too much, it diminishes the threat of the villain. So by having him antagonize his own people, it makes us fear what he could possibly do if he has the heroes within his grasp. Also, if you look at just the first two movies, every time Vader is around one of our heroes, it ends poorly for them. Vader is with Leia and she gets captured. Vader confronts Obi-Wan and he kills him. Vader is around Han and Leia, he captures them both and sends Han away with Boba Fett. Vader meets Luke for the first time, he kicks his ass and shatters his worldview. This sets a precedent that Vader is not someone to take lightly. There's nothing revolutionary here. In these first two films, Vader isn't the most complex villain in the world, but he didn't need to be. He just needed to be a threatening and fearful presence, and that's exactly what he was. What I now want to cover is the big reveal. Why is Darth Vader being Luke's father such a fantastic twist? Two reasons. The first is that the twist was not something that the audience was expecting an answer to. With Darth Vader, we weren't asking ourselves for two movies who Luke's father was. When Obi-Wan told us Vader was his father, we believed him. Brief spoilers for Game of Thrones, the reason the twist behind Jon Snow's parents was so great was because we weren't really expecting it either. If you were a hardcore fan who read deeply into every line of the books, you would suspect the truth. But most people just believed Ned Stark when he said Jon was a bastard. We were questioning who his real mother was, but at least for me, it never crossed my mind that Ned wasn't his father. So again with Luke, since we were never questioning who his father was, it hits that much harder learning the truth. The second reason this twist works so perfectly is because of how it shatters Luke's worldview. For 2 movies now, Luke's view of his father had been developed. When Owen briefly mentions Luke's father, we see Luke instantly light up. When Obi-Wan talks about Luke's father, we see how much that means to Luke. In this movie, Luke says the only reason he wants to become a Jedi is because his father was one. Luke was also told that Vader killed his father, so he now has this built-up hatred for Vader. All of that is shattered in an instant. Darth Vader being Luke's father now forces Luke to question his reasons behind wanting to be a Jedi. Yes, it's one of the most shocking twists, but it's also one of the most impactful twists ever. The movie ends with Luke hanging on by a thread, and for the first time, he is actually patient. He taps into the Force, reaching out to Leia, and she hears him. Finally, Luke trusted in himself and effectively saved his own life. I have my minor criticisms of Luke's arc in this movie, but overall it was excellent. It is so important to see Luke getting beaten up to high hell, because it makes the final movie that much more impactful. Luke's a nice character in the first movie, but he does not have much development. He's basically a stand-in for the audience. The Empire Strikes Back is what begins to develop Luke into one of the most beloved characters in cinema. And this film deserves to be applauded for that. Moving on from Luke, let's talk about Han and Leia. Han and Leia's story is frankly the perfect side story to go alongside Luke. I think on its own, Han and Leia's side story couldn't carry a film, but because it complements Luke's story, we remain invested. Since Luke spends a good chunk of this movie away with Yoda, there's no immediate threat to him. Because of that, you need to contrast that story with a story like Han and Leia's story where the characters are constantly in danger. That's why the running gag throughout the movie with the hyperdrive not working on the Falcon works so well, because it puts our characters in constant danger. It's not until the end of the film when the hyperdrive is fixed where our characters can finally take a breather. Now, regardless of the stakes or tension, that alone can't carry a storyline. At first, I struggled a bit to understand why this storyline with Han and Leia works so well. It's not like Han or Leia have an arc either go on. With that being said, I think the reason this storyline works so well is simply because the writers have done the legwork to get get us to care about these characters. And we want to see Han and Leia fall in love. Right away when the movie begins, the romantic tension between Han and Leia is front and center. This entire storyline is why it was so brilliant of Lucas to hire another writer. Not because Lucas couldn't have thought of this storyline or anything like that, but because Lucas couldn't write dialogue this good to save his life. The banter between Han and Leia is simply perfect. It's entertaining, and because it's entertaining, we want to see more of it. Now, the other thing the writers did to make this work is that the beginning of the movie reinforces our love for these characters. With Han, he's quite the asshole to begin the movie. While it's entertaining, it could have easily made Han just an unlikable person. But while everything Han says is antagonistic, his actions are the opposite. The moment he finds out Luke hasn't come back yet, without hesitation he goes outside and risks his life to find him. The rebels try to convince him out of it, but Han doesn't care one bit. His friend is in trouble and he's going after Luke. Actions speak louder than words. Han may sound like he's a jerk, but his actions show us how caring and compassionate he really is. Later in the first act, Han could have very easily left Hoth no problem, but he decided to go check in on Leia to make sure she was okay. Why? Because despite Han's bravado, we can tell he cares. This is what makes us love Han, and therefore we are invested in him throughout the rest of the story. There's one other detail about Han that I find to be important, and it's something that is severely lacking in movies these days. I can't emphasize it enough how important it is that Han is a competent individual. This entire storyline doesn't work if Han is incompetent. Usually these days, stories make a character some bumbling idiot that needs to be saved by his or her friend. Han, on the other hand, repeatedly shows that he is more than capable of getting he and Leia out of the situation. Sure, sometimes he improvises and looks silly, but it's Han's quick thinking that gets them all the way to Bespin. It's so important that Han is competent because we need to think there's actually a chance Han and Leia can escape the Empire. If Han was bumbling around the entire movie, then we'd have no doubt that they would get captured, and therefore there is no tension throughout most of the movie. But again, since Han is competent, we believe he and Leia can escape. In the third act, when Han does get captured, it's not because he was incompetent or because he made a mistake, it's because he was simply outsmarted by Vader. This way Han is defeated, but we still respect him and his competence. All this I've said about Han is why The Empire Strikes Back is Han's best film. He's entertaining, he's charismatic, and he's also competent. Everyone wants to be Han Solo, and it's because of this movie. With Leia, I'm a bit conflicted about her. You know, I'm constantly told that Leia is one of the best characters in Star Wars and that she's so iconic, but in this movie at least, she isn't given much to do, which is strange because she's in the entire movie. The first film really showed Leia being a badass. The way she stood up to the Empire, and especially Vader and Tarkin, is not something you see in a princess. Those traits set her apart and make us want to root for her. In The Empire Strikes Back, we don't get that from Leia much. Sure, she's leading the rebels in the beginning, but those scenes are few and far between. For the rest of the movie, honestly, her role is simply to fall in love with Han. That's it. She's just there so she can watch Han do impressive shit, and then fall in love with him. There's only tension at the end of the movie because we're hoping she can rescue Han, but she doesn't succeed. Now, it could have been really easy for the audience to hate Leia. Since she doesn't do much, we could see her as a burden, someone who is holding Han back, but that's never the case either. Even though Han is the one leading here, Leia is never shown derailing Han in any way. She's usually doing stuff to help out, and while she does often criticize Han for his insane plans, she does also compliment him when they do work out. If she was negative all the time, we'd hate her and wonder what Han sees in her. But because Leia is a helpful person, and she's also genuinely nice to be around, we root for her as well. The storylines of The Empire Strikes Back perfectly complement each other to make one excellent film. From Luke's story about failure to Han and Leia's intense chase sequence, this movie grips us from beginning to end. Now, as I promised before, we need to look at how the film changed during its 1997 special edition re-release. So, let's dive deep into the special edition of The Empire Strikes Back and see what changes were made. Now, unlike A New Hope, which had major changes in the special editions, there's barely any changes in The Empire Strikes Back. There's no pathetically bad CGI, there's no added scenes, it's almost entirely improved visual effects and a few new added shots. Some of these added shots are a few new looks at the Wampa eating something, there's an extra shot of Slave One chasing the Millennium Falcon, there's a lot of new shots of Cloud City, both when Han arrives for the first time and later on during a scene transition, and then there are some new shots shots of Vader landing on a Star Destroyer. I would say the shots of Cloud City do enhance the movie. Bespin is a very visually pleasing planet to look at, so more shots of the background are usually always better. These extra shots of the Wampa or Vader entering a Star Destroyer are nothing burgers. They don't enhance the movie, but they don't hurt it either. Some other changes include minor dialogue changes. I won't go through every example, but there are a handful of examples where like one line of dialogue is changed. When Luke lifts up R2, originally Luke says, "You're lucky you don't taste very good," but in the special edition Luke says, "You were lucky to get out of there." During the Palpatine sequence, for one, we obviously see Ian McDiarmid instead of this ghoul, but some of the dialogue is also changed. Overall, I like the change of showing Ian McDiarmid. His delivery of the lines is much better than before, but I don't like the change of dialogue. In the special edition, Palpatine says, "I believe he is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker," and then Vader says, "How is that possible?" This line of Vader saying, "How is that possible?" makes him look like an idiot. Am I supposed to believe this is the moment where Vader finds out that Luke is his son? Because earlier in the movie, he talks about needing to find Skywalker. So either Vader is dumb enough to think that someone named Luke Skywalker is not his son, or he is blatantly lying to Palpatine here. Either way, this is an unnecessary change to the movie. Another dialogue change is one line where Vader is talking about his shuttle.
"Bring my shuttle."
"Alert my Star Destroyer to prepare for my arrival."
I prefer the old line, but I don't really care. Something to note is that there are multiple special editions of each movie. There's the first version in 1997, then there's another one in 2004, and then the final one in 2011. In the modern day version and the theatrical version of The Empire Strikes Back, when Luke is falling, he just falls in silence. In the 1997 version, and this is only in that version, Lucas decided to add Palpatine's scream over Luke falling. This change was so bad, it borderline ruined the scene. Thank God in 2004 Lucas got rid of that scream. Some other changes include the change to Boba Fett's voice. Originally he had his own unique voice, but because Boba Fett became a clone in the prequels, they redubbed Boba's voice with Tamora Morrison's voice, aka Jango Fett's voice. This is a continuity change and it makes sense. The biggest special edition changes in The Empire Strikes Back are probably the windows added to a handful of Bespin shots. A handful of shots of Bespin were added to show the beautiful scenery. I kinda like these changes, except the implementation of some of these shots is kinda weak. Now, just like I did with A New Hope, I'm gonna give an award for the best special edition change and the worst special edition change of this movie. The best special edition change goes to these added shots of Bespin. It's a beautiful planet and I love seeing more of it. The award for the worst special edition change has to go to Luke's scream. It's the only special edition change from the movie that I would genuinely say derails the film, but thankfully it was only in the 1997 version. Of all the original trilogy films, The Empire Strikes Back is the one that was altered the least, and thank God for that. Let's wrap up the video by looking at the reception of The Empire Strikes Back. As of today, The Empire Strikes Back has grossed $550 million worldwide at the box office, with roughly $91.1 million of that coming from multiple re-releases. At least domestically, The Empire Strikes Back was easily the highest grossing movie of the year, nearly doubling the movie in second place. When it comes to the ratings, The Empire Strikes Back scored a 95% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 97% audience score. This makes it the highest rated Star Wars movie on Rotten Tomatoes. On IMDb, the film scored an 8.7 out of 10, which, like Rotten Tomatoes, makes it the highest rated Star Wars movie. But that also makes it the 15th best movie ever made, according to IMDb. What do you guys think about The Empire Strikes Back? Let me know down below. Tune back in a couple days to see me cover Return of the Jedi. That'll be a fun one. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to tonight the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.